The summer of 1916 marks the opening stages of the Battle of the Somme, a massive Anglo-French offensive across a 22-mile-long front with the hopes of breaking the German line in the Somme Valley of northern France, and to relieve pressure on the French city of Verdun that was fending off a German attack that had started nearly 6 months earlier. The Somme Valley represented the boundary between French and British forces on their line, the Brits up north and the French down south, making it the perfect area for a joint attack. The stage was being set up months before the battle had taken place. The Anglo-French force of roughly 750,000 men was first up against a tough and elaborate German trench line that had been heavily fortified and lined with sturdy bunkers. Behind this, another mile back, was a second German trench line, and behind that, a third, with a total of around 400,000 defenders. The Anglo-French force knew the strength of the German defense, and they would do everything in their power to weaken their enemy. The precursor to this battle was one that could be heard from miles away, and to set the stage for the bloodshed that was to come. For several days, starting on the 24th of June, an Anglo-French artillery bombardment of 1.5 million shells would rain hell upon the German line, the eerie, gut-wrenching sounds of which could be heard echoing across the English Channel all the way to London. The purpose of this aerial hellfire was to clear the way for the infantry. High Command hoped that the German defensive positions and their equipment would be obliterated by the barrage. Being on the receiving end of this terror in itself is hard to imagine, but the accounts of German soldiers on the days leading up to the battle give us a glimpse of the horrors, as well as the problems they faced underneath one of the largest artillery barrages of the war. Officer Felix Kircher of the German 26th Reserve Artillery Regiment wrote of this week of hell. On the 24th of June, thousands of guns opened fire on our trenches, dugouts, communication trenches, artillery positions, and roads. We could not get any supplies from behind. No ammunition, no food, no water. The bearers of such things had to carry them 3 to 5 kilometers and had to jump from shell hole to shell hole. What I really want to emphasize from Kircher's account here is something to notice. The shells themselves were of course dangerous, but most of the dangers they posed was not from the collateral damage they did, instead it came from the obstacle it posed for German logistics, and both sides would face these logistical problems caused by artillery throughout the war. Men carrying supplies from shell hole to shell hole makes you wonder who really is facing the most danger here. The German soldiers on the direct receiving end of this bombardment tucked away in their bunkers, or the unlucky few who were sent out to make a supply run. As was already mentioned prior, the Germans had made some surprisingly tough bunkers for themselves to hide in, and Grenadier Walter of the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment provides us an account straight out of one of these German strongholds located to the far north of the German line at Bayamount Hamel. The 7-day bombardment by the English did not cause us any losses. Our battalion occupied a 3-line trench system and had built very strong and deep shelters. Our dugouts were 8 to 10 meters deep and had been strengthened by heavy wooden beams and railroad ties. Luckily for us, this provided quite adequate shelter. This account really does speak to the strength of the German position, but one can only imagine what it must have felt like to be on the receiving end of this for days, and that's not even to mention the fact that they had to do this all the while remaining in a cramped bunker with presumably little light or fresh air. And remember that there would be times that the British and French would not stop firing these shells. It would go on for hours at a time. It would have been near to impossible to get any shut-eye as the crashing sounds of explosions shook the earth around them all through the night. And it's surprising to think that for the German troops stationed at Bayamount Hamel, the sounds of blasting shells would not be the only thing keeping them up at night. The quote from Walter continues, "But several days before the 1st of July, we had heard underground digging, and knew a mine was being dug and prepared." As the English and French struck fire from above, the British also prepared to strike the enemy from below. British troops dug holes towards the German line, and placed explosives at key points that they hoped would take the enemy by surprise before they sent their infantry forces forward. The British would dig 17 of these tunnels to place their massive amount of explosives, and one of these was placed directly under the noses of the German forces at Bayamount Hamel. The French and British were putting everything on the line with this push. The 7 days of artillery barrages pummeling the first German line was about to come to an end. The troops were in position, and the explosives had been put in place. The answer to the reality of their hopes of the effectiveness of the artillery attack would come on the first day of July, 1916. At 7:28 in the morning, the British detonated mines that they had dug and placed under German bunkers. One of these mines contained 66,000 pounds of explosives, and when it was detonated, it created at the time the largest man-made sound in history. Unsuspecting Germans must have felt as if the earth upon which they stood was being ripped out by the hand of God, followed by an ear-shattering explosion to signal what was to come. Shortly afterwards, at 7:30 a.m., the infantry phase of the attack began. Brave men in the Anglo-French forces arose from their trenches to make the perilous journey across no man's land. Thousands of British troops to the north were ordered to go over the top in close formation, just as they had trained to be. These British troops advanced at walking speed in order to maintain order. After all, they thought that there was no need for any haste. The German line by this point must be the equivalent of a crater on the moon. In a matter of moments, the British must have realized that their dreams were not based in reality. Even after a weeks-long artillery bombardment, the Germans' defenses remained strong, mostly thanks to their deep-dug bunkers, and the surprising ineffectivity of the British shells. It is estimated that only 2/3 of the rounds that the British fired prior to this battle actually went off, and in many cases, as the poor British soldiers would find out, their shells just made getting to the enemy an even more daunting task. The English and French hoped that their artillery shells would utterly destroy the barbed wire put in place by the Germans, but all it truly did was make the barbed wire an even more tangly and spread out death trap. As the British and French made their way across no man's land, they were met by close to 100 German MG-08 machine guns, unscathed by the artillery, that cut down Anglo-French troops who were stalled by the tangly death grip of barbed wire. In some areas, the British found themselves bottlenecked by the scattered wire and helplessly slaughtered by a rain of bullets. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book called The Real War 1914 to 1918, specifically an account by Captain B.H. Littleheart. He puts the British situation at the Somme as well as the power of the German defenses into a crystal clear picture, and I quote, "July 1st dawned a day of broiling heat, and at 7 a.m. the bombardment rose to its height. Half an hour later, the infantry advanced from their trenches, and thousands fell, strewing no man's land with their bodies, before the German front trench was even reached. For their opponents were the Germans of 1916, most stubborn and skillful fighters. While the shells flattened their trenches, they sheltered in dugouts, or shell holes, and then as the barrage lifted, dragged out their machine guns, to pour an unslakening hail of lead into the unduly dense waves of the attackers. For 1916 marked the nadir of infantry attacks. Nadir meaning the lowest point in the fortunes, basically rock bottom, and I continue the quote, "The revival of formations that were akin to the 18th century in their formalism and lack of maneuvering power. Battalions attacked in 4 or 8 waves, not more than 100 yards apart, the men in each almost shoulder to shoulder, in a symmetrical, well-dressed alignment, and taught to advance steadily upright at a slow walk with their rifles held aslant in front of them, bayonets upwards, so as to catch the eye of the observant enemy. An excellent imitation of Frederick's infantry automata." What he is alluding to there is Frederick the Great's Prussian army, which marched in these tight formations. Continuing the quote again, "With the difference that they were no longer advancing against muskets of an effective range of barely 100 yards. It is hardly remarkable that by the nightfall on July 1st, many battalions were barely 100 strong. Haig, that being the commander-in-chief of the British force on the Western Front, General Sir Douglas Haig," and I'm continuing the quote, "indeed, had laid down that the Verdun method of the Germans should be adopted, strong patrols feeling their way forward to test the result of the bombardment before the mass of the infantry were committed." And here I come to talk again. That method, with hindsight, makes a lot of sense, right? Continuing the quote, "But his chief of staff, Kegel, nevertheless ordered waves. Only as the upstanding waves were broken up by the fire did advance become possible. For then, human nature and primitive cunning reasserted themselves against authorized tactics. The more enterprising and still uncowed survivors formed little groups, usually under some natural leader, and worked their way by short rushes, and crawling from shell hole to shell hole, stalking the opposing machine guns and often progressing to a considerable depth with little further loss. But in many places, packets of the enemy and nests of machine guns were left in their wake to take heavy toll of the supports." As I imagine, especially after that account, it has to be very hard for some to understand why the British took this approach with marching their infantry in a tight formation, no matter how little resistance they had expected when capturing the first German trench line. And it even looks like that Haig would agree with you. But let's acknowledge a few things here. First off, the British were still learning about how this new era of warfare would be fought in 1916. World War I would be the first large-scale conflict to witness the usage of machine guns as an effective weapon, which completely changes the game. Remember that not just half a century ago, that wars in Europe were being fought in that American Civil War, or as Captain Littleheart just used as an example, Frederick the Great's line of infantry-style battles. This whole more spread-out modern way of fighting concept we have, which we will see from this conflict onward even to this day, the great powers would have to learn for themselves. What the British did here at this battle, the lesson that they would take away that machine guns will completely rip the beating heart out of tight formations, was the same one that the Germans and French learned in the opening months of the conflict not just two years earlier. Every major power went into this war preparing to play checkers, only to realize that the game had become chess. And sadly, they all had to learn this lesson in the worst way possible. For the British, they would receive this message in the number 57,470. That was the number of British casualties suffered on the first day at the Somme, of which 19,240 were killed. The vast majority due to machine gun fire. Some regiments, such as the 1st Newfoundland Regiment that attacked the Germans north at Bay Mount Hamel, suffered 90% casualties. While the British did take some of their first day objectives further down the line, the trade-off in lives taken dampened any feeling of victory at these advancements. The amount of men that the British lost that day continues to be the worst in the nation's history in terms of casualties. All of these deaths are their own mini tragedies, but the one that sends what I believe is the most depressing image in my head are the casualties suffered by the PALS battalions. These PALS battalions are British volunteers who enlisted together so that they could serve alongside one another with the people that they knew. 20 of the 32 of these PALS battalions suffered over 500 casualties on the first day of the offensive. These deaths, composed of primarily young men who fell beside their loved ones, who watched as their neighbors, family members, and lifelong friends met a gruesome demise. To me, when I put myself in those men's shoes, that idea is one of the hardest ones to process. The French also had it hard-pressed, although not to the same extent as the British. The French were up against weaker German defenses on the southern end of the line, also thanks to their greater experience, heavy artillery, and due to the fact that the Germans weren't even expecting attacks that far south down the line. They did a decent job breaking through the German line. However, they still met the same ferocity by German troops and suffered many casualties, all the while making better progress than the British. Now all this seems like hell for the Anglo-French soldiers who were shell-hopping across no man's land under fire, and it certainly was, but let us not forget that the Germans in the face of this experienced a whole other hell of their own. Remember what I mentioned earlier about the effects of artillery on German logistics? Now, not only does this cause problems with getting supplies to the front lines for the Germans, it also causes problems with getting things out from the front lines. What I'm about to read next comes from Richard Swats, of the 121st Reserve Infantry Regiment. He reveals what I'm trying to hint at, and it is by far one of the most horrifying images you can get from this battle alone. Before I read this, I should say that this account comes from after the artillery barrage, in the midst of the first assault, and I quote, "The principal work of the doctors and other medical personnel began on the morning of July 1st, soon after the English infantry's great frontal attack. At 8:30, the first lightly wounded streamed in. Not until the afternoon and evening were the stretcher bearers able to bring in the badly wounded, some of them with horrible head, lung, and abdomen injuries, in addition to smashed bones of every conceivable type." Not a very pretty sight, isn't it? For some, the accounts of these injuries is what is most disturbing, but for me, however, it's the idea that the most badly wounded had to wait to get medical attention. That really does get my stomach turning. The thought of having to wait for help while you're spilling out blood from a gaping hole in your chest is unimaginable. And it's completely understandable to wonder why these men with the worst of injuries weren't the first to get back on stretchers, but put yourself in the shoes of medical personnel for a moment. If you see a guy who's lost a limb due to an explosion wreathing on the ground in pain versus a man who's taken a bullet or two to the arm, you're going to take the logical step and get the second guy back to the medical tent first, because as much as you'd like to help the other man, you're going to have to admit to yourself that his chances of survival are low. So is the bitter nature of war. The Battle of the Somme would continue for another 5 months, with multiple more costly pushes made by the Anglo-French forces. One very notable event that occurred during the grueling months-long offensive was the introduction of the tank, a vehicle that would change the face of warfare. that the British employed at the Flers-Courcelette region on September the 15th to the north of the battlefield. 29 armored vehicles made their way across no man's land, leaving the German soldiers in shock at the sight of these never-before-seen lumbering metal titans as they made their way over the barbed wire defenses straight into the German line. These tanks proved quite effective, despite their frequent operational problems, and on that day the British broke 2 miles deep in the German line on that sector, despite the fact that 2/3 of these vehicles didn't even make it to the German line. On the closing months of the battle, another pain befell on the already beaten troops at the Somme: the weather. Snowfall made the battlefield like a hell froze over, and no doubt made for some even more unhappy soldiers in trench helmets. Finally, by the 18th of November, due to increasingly bitter weather and the exhaustion of Anglo-French troops after over 140 days of battle, the offensive had come to an end. Over the course of 5 months, the Germans had lost within the range of 2 to 8 miles along a frontage of 11 miles to the British and French, and are estimated to have suffered 230,000 casualties to the advances. The low total of ground lost is seen as a testament to the strength of their lines, despite the heavy cost. Before I talk about the next statistic, I have to mention that every one of these deaths is its own mini tragedy. It is so easy to get lost in the wide array of numbers. Take in that statistic for a moment. The Germans took 230,000 casualties. That means half of the men that begun this battle on the German side were either killed or wounded. If that isn't already appalling enough, the British and French took even more staggering losses. The Anglo-French force by the end of this offensive suffered around 650,000 combined casualties, nearly triple that of the Germans. If we put that in terms of ground taken, at where they penetrated deepest into the German line, they suffered 81,250 casualties a mile. Beyond the appalling losses, there were many lessons learned by both sides, spelt out in the spilt blood of young men. The British in particular learned something vital about this new era of warfare, and how to better their tactics for future assaults that were essential in bringing the conflict to an end not just 2 years later. The Battle of the Somme can be viewed as a defensive victory for the Germans, as they prevented any major breakthrough while proving their own military power. But the British and French did succeed in at least one way. Their push successfully drew the Germans' focus away from Verdun, another horrendously bloody conflict that will be mentioned in the next video. 1 million men at the Somme were either killed or wounded, and millions more would be by the end of this conflict just 2 years later in 1918. I'm happy I could share some of their stories with you today, and I highly encourage that you join me in the sequels to this video to hear more of them, and also that you go out and learn more about one of the most interesting, devastating, ground-shaking, history-changing conflicts of all time. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Some regiments, such as the 1st Newfoundland Regiment, that attacked the... Oh, hold on one moment. Newfoundland...